Talk wasn't recorded. Okay.
Sorry. That's the next one. Okay, Mel's, you're on.
Perfect. Well, first of all, thank you everybody for your patience. We want to make sure everything is accessible. So thank you for waiting as we got everything set up. My name is Mel Felton. I use they, them pronouns. I am one of the two April Youth Board seats, as well as the Youth Project and Underserved Communities Coordinator for the Disability Action Center over in Eastern Washington, North Idaho. And thank you so much for joining us today for this workshop. I want to mention a few housekeeping items before we get started. First, when you scroll over the screen, a menu bar pops up. Depending on what device you are on, you can find the menu bar either at the top or at the bottom of the screen. This is where you'll find closed captioning for today's session. You can view the captioning by selecting the CC tab on the menu bar. Stream text is also available for today's calls. You can find that in the conference website connection instructions for this session. For sign language interpreting, you can find the interpreter on the screen. You can change the interpreter's panelist box when a presentation is being shown or shared by moving the bar over. It will turn gray when you're hovering over it, so move it over to the left if you want to make the interpreter bigger. To join into the chat, please find the word bubble in the same menu bar. Once that is selected, that will allow you to follow along with the chat or add comments. For Q&A, please use the Q&A box that you will see in the same bottom panel. If you have a question, and this will be a very conversational breakout, please use the Q&A. I will be trying to keep up with any questions that are posted in the chat, but there is a chance that your question will be missed. So if you have a question, post it in the Q&A. You can also ask questions or make a comment. You can use the raise hand option on the menu. That also allows us to know if you have a question. For those of you using the phone today or using keystrokes, we ask that you press *9 on your keypad to raise your hand. We will then let you know when we unmute you. And also, I think most importantly in these Zoom times, if you are joining in on the conversation through audio, please keep background sounds to a minimum, and if you are not speaking, keep yourself on mute. With that, I am going to pass this presentation over to Christiana. For those of you who have maybe dropped into some of our Youth Coordinators Connect this past year, you may have had a chance to hear them speak. And I was so happy to have them back, a fellow Washingtonian and a fellow dog lover. So thank you so much for being here, Christiana, and speaking at our first virtual youth conference. And the floor is yours.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. Thank you for that introduction. My name is Christiana Obi Sumner. My pronouns are they, them. For those who, for image description, I am a Black non-binary person with Black secretary glasses and wearing a black sweater with a turtleneck and an amethyst pendant and a black and white patterned head wrap. I am in a room full of a ridiculous amount of books, as well as a guitar case and a small dog that you may see come in and out of the shot, or hear doing various puppy things. Today, I was asked to chat a little bit about intersectionality, and some other sort of things. So I some ways that we can make this somewhat interactive, because to be completely honest, I had a PowerPoint I was going to talk about intersectionality, equality, equity, and justice, and what it means to be in solidarity or an accomplice. However, I guess because it is Tuesday, it decided to update, and so now all of my Microsoft Office is being a thing. So I will just talk a little bit. If you have any questions or responses, like I said, like with questions you put in the Q&A, that'd be great. And then we could talk about it. I would love to answer any questions that you have, no bad questions. Or if there's anything that resonates with you or any personal stories around this too, please put that in the chat. I have the chat open, so if it's something that you'd like to share, I would love to hear about it. So let's first talk about intersectionality. Um, I'm unsure how many of y'all have heard of the term intersectionality. This is one of those terms that's been pretty um, popular in the media. A lot of people have talked about it, or maybe a buzzword being a term that people use a lot. That the difficulty with buzzwords is that you use it so often that sometimes the meaning changes. So let's talk a little bit about where intersectionality came from. So intersectionality is a term that was coined originally in the 80s, though it's a conversation that people have been having for a very long time. There was a legal scholar who named Kimberly Crenshaw, and in the 80s, she was doing a research of, she was doing some research on a case that was happening with a manufacturing plant. And the people who were working at the manufacturing plant, there were Black folks and there were women. And this manufacturing plant said, no, we're not disqualifying people based on their appearance. They, Black folks and women work here. So there must be some issue or mistake if people are saying that. However, Black marginalized genders, particularly as it's shared in the documents from Kimberly Crenshaw, Black women, um, were saying that they weren't able to get jobs. So when Kimberly Crenshaw investigated, she did find that they were hiring Black folks at the manufacturing plant, but they were primarily hiring Black cis het men, and they were hiring them for back of house work, so working on the assembly line, and all of that sort of hard labor based on this idea, the sexist idea that only cis het men can do that sort of work. And they were hiring women, but they were primarily hiring white women for that front of the house administrative work, like secretarial work or filing work or management work or lay management, because still sexism, but also in this case, racism, or particularly anti-Blackness, in that they didn't want sort of the face of the company as people came in to be a Black person. So when Kimberly Crenshaw asked, sort of where this pattern came from and whether they would take the time to actually, make sure that there was equity, which we'll get to in a second, they said that they were concerned around holding, both of those identities at once, not because of the compounding intersectional impact of oppression, marginalization, or exploitation, but more they thought that it would give them some sort of advantage to hold both of them. This was during a time after the Civil Rights Act, after the Black Power movement, moving into a conversation about affirmative action in the 80s. Affirmative action is a term that was originally brought out by uh, President Kennedy, JFK, and it was supposed to be sort of a product of the Civil Rights Act, which was passed in 1964, so 57 years ago, to make sure that the systems and institutions and policies that were not created for folks pre 1964 were actually had those catchment or those pieces to make sure that they were really allowing folks to have a fair shot at things like jobs, education, housing, things like that. It's very contentious in that people felt that in providing a measure that would essentially hold historical and systemic oppression. Historical meaning that it has happened for a very long time, systemic meaning that it's just sort of baked into the way things are done every day, would give people an unfair advantage. And so it continues to be a very contentious topic with only a few states and very uh, uh, specific situations, primarily around college admissions, where affirmative action is used. So let's talk about the other thing I'll say about intersectionality. The original term, so I say this story because the original term of intersectionality was created to mean precisely what Kimberly Crenshaw was studying, which is what does it mean when racism, or in particular anti-Blackness, and sexism or misogyny come together and create a compounding or intersectional impact in someone's lived experience. Another term that you may hear someone say to be super wonky is misogynois. Misogyn being like misogyny or a form of sexism, specifically to the folks of marginalized gender. And NOIR, which is a French term for Black, so Black misogyny. Since that time, primarily in the spaces of academia, because before we had like the internet, which has really revolutionized a lot of things. I'm in this interesting age group where I remember the internet coming on and computers coming on, but the internet being kind of limited. And so you still had to rely on things like CD-ROM services or old sort of search engines like Ask Jeeves or something like that. So if you didn't know what to search for, you didn't really know very much. And even then, the internet did not have as much information as it used to. So a lot of the conversation up until the 21st century, around the early 2000s, has really been kept inside of spaces like colleges or what they call academia. And so, of course, as you can see in terms of class, that if you or your parents or your grandparents, etc., were not able to go to college, they may not have been able to have these sort of conversations. And unlike today, they were just not conversations that people were having. As a matter of fact, and to this day still, I think, it was considered rude to have a conversation around politics, which this would be considered politics. But especially as we got into the 2010s, some of those conversations started to come out of the university and academic system and into sort of the general conversation. So we started to hear more terms like equity and intersectionality and critical race theory, things that usually would, be very inaccessible to most people, and in a lot of ways still is, because we're only really talking about 10-15 years since this has been a conversation in the general public, and terms and conversations that would be, on the internet, on social media, which is also fairly new for a lot of people, in the scheme of things. In things like, the videos that we watch, or things like that, the news, using these sort of things. And, we're coming from a space, especially with the news, where a lot of the older generations, including my own, were kind of brought up to believe the news as it came on the evening. So there used to be folks like Walter Cronkite, which everyone would, after dinner, go at 8 o'clock and watch the evening news with Walter Cronkite. And that, if the news said it, it was doctrine. Now people can go online and they can learn things for themselves. And I share this because what happens in those moments is, when it becomes disaggregated, is, number one, more people have access to it, which is the positive. But then also more people are interpreting it, and then kind of creating their own sort of understandings or interpretations of what certain things mean, which can be a negative, because then when people talk about certain things, then they don't really know which of the definitions they're supposed to use. So now when we have a conversation on intersectionality, it is a little bit, there's some people who kind of argue over it. Some people say, we should keep it to the original understanding that Kimberly Crenshaw meant, which is, Black marginalized gender, and that is the intersectionality, is what it means. And then on the other side, there is people who say intersectionality, in a more contemporary understanding of it, should mean when people have two or more lived experiences that come together and into a singular moment. So whether that's your race or your gender or your sexual orientation or your class or your nationality or your language, whatever that may be, that whenever two or more of them come together in an experience, that should matter, whether it's a privileged identity or not. And I think that where perhaps a compromise is right now is in the middle, where it doesn't have to be about being Black, marginalized gender, and it doesn't have to be just any two or more lived experiences, but perhaps two or more lived experiences that are traditionally marginalized, oppressed, or exploited. I will also share, when I say privileged identity, some people kind of hear that and think that it means that they are actively receiving something. But I think what's important here is to think about ways that we passively receive something. So essentially, when I say privilege, what I'm saying is that people have a choice. Whether it seems like a choice or not is a different conversation. But when I say that a person has a choice, it means that when you wake up or you go outside or you get dressed, that there are certain things that you still have to think about in terms of how not only would it affect you in general, but how it may deeply impact your ability to move through and access space. So if for example, I think one of the things that's been great about the pandemic is that there's a lot of folks, for example, who wear head wraps like I do. And before the pandemic, I used to have a lot of folks tell me about how my hair was quote unquote unprofessional, just the way that it was growing out of my head, because it's very kinky coily. And so the difficulty about that would mean if I was going into a space and I wanted to make sure someone saw me as professional, I would be required to chemically alter or straighten my hair. This is an issue that people have talked about, and they have taken it all the way up to the Supreme Court of the United States and said, it's not fair for folks to um, be asked to leave a job or to be dismissed from school simply because their hair does not reflect um, this what they call Eurocentric point of view, which Eurocentric is a term that means anything that is sort of um, uh, anything that is sort of centered around what a European aesthetic would look like. So, in this case, hair being Eurocentric would mean that the bar for what it means to be a professional would mean that your hair should look like someone who is European. And as you can tell, that's very problematic. So let's talk really quick about justice, equity, and equality. We have a lot of language in our country around equality. Equality essentially means that everyone has the same exact shot, the same exact resources, and they are supposed to use those same resources and opportunities to reach a goal that everyone theoretically can attain. But let's talk about that. One of the main documents that we think about that talks a lot about equality is the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. However, what people don't know or don't like to think about is that both the Constitution and the Bill of Rights were written during a time where there was still enslaved people in this country. And those people would not be freed for almost another century. Not to mention that even once the Emancipation Proclamation was passed, that proclamation, as well as the Constitution and the Civil War, were not intended for Black folks to remain in the United States. If, when the Civil War was happening, Abraham Lincoln uh, called a council of some Black scholars who was talking about what it would mean for Black liberation. And Lincoln, at that point, told them that he had no intention of freeing enslaved people and then having them integrate into America, but instead wished to send them away, either back to the African continent or elsewhere. It's where the country of Liberia was created and why the capital of Liberia is Monroeville, after former United States President James Monroe. It was a place where they planned to send all of the enslaved Black folks in the United States back to Africa, but it was a plan that was ended. So, in a lot of ways, the difficulty about this conversation is that equality as we understand it was never really about being equal. Equity is also a space in this way where you're holding the fact that people are not starting from the same place. There are these sort of barriers and bottlenecks, so to speak, of how people may need to start this. When I was in Kentucky, I lived in Kentucky for 6 years, and they have this yearly pageant, essentially is what it's called, what it is, called the Kentucky Derby. And it's a month-long celebration, but it culminates in this horse race that lasts about 90 seconds. And folks will spend their entire life to train and learn how to ride race horses. And the way that it always starts is they bring all the horses around the track, and then they get them into these starting gates. And then they play this sound on the horn that you probably have heard before in a cartoon. And then they say, and they're off. And they open up the gates, and then they run around the track. In a lot of ways, equality is saying that everyone has a horse that, first of all, everyone has a horse. That's the first thing. Everyone has a horse. And then everyone has a racehorse. And then everyone has a racehorse that has been trained for a race. That everyone has a racehorse that's been trained for a race that is ready to race on that day on that track with that jockey or the person who rides the horse. It's even assuming that everyone is in the starting gate, that everyone's starting gate opens at the bell, and that everyone is even at the venue. If you think about it, equality is assuming that we are all born with the same rights and privileges. But as we have seen and continue to see, especially even if we just take what has happened this year in terms of the pandemic, in terms of the housing crisis, in terms of the climate disaster, and we haven't even gotten to race yet, or disability, which we've seen with deprioritization of care. There is a lot of those barriers and bottlenecks for people to even get to the starting gate, let alone for them to race within the Derby without other people having advantages or things like that, or people specifically having obstacles put in their way. Some horses needing to go over actual hurdles, whereas some horses just get to uh, uh, race on flat ground. And so essentially the difference between equality and equity is that equity is acknowledging that we have historical and systemic barriers for certain people, then certain communities of people. And a lot of them is based on a really, really big $10,000 term called social construction. Social construction, as you see from Arius in the chat, is essentially the act of people, humans coming together and saying, this is what this means. And then based on those people coming together and saying, this is what this means, either explicitly, so they're sitting around the table and saying, talking about it, or implicitly, they all just kind of come to believe something. Is it leads to these expectations and assumptions and biases that people then use to make judgment or to classify or to caricaturize. And then that is how people either do or do not have access to certain spaces or resources. If you think about it, one of the ways that we think about construct, or at least I've been talking about with people in my community about construct, is that I come from a heritage called the Igbo or the Obi. The Obi was a priest class in the Igbo tribe. The Igbo tribe was from Nigeria. And the Obi were specifically bought and sold in the transatlantic slave trade into Jamaica, into Britain. Britain occupied Jamaica. The Obi were the priest class, and so they were sold as what they were then reconstructed as witch doctors or practicing black magic. And it took it to this day. Obis are the Obeah, what they might be called Obia, are still outlawed in a lot of ways, and so it took a space from this is how we have a spiritual practice that is normalized to today where it's seen as devil worship or voodoo or some other sort of word, and it's because of this sort of classification and characterization of people. Another example is that you may have heard about the stimulus payments, the $1,200 stimulus payments. I think they said it was an individual who is making up to $75,000 a year could also get the $1,200 stimulus payment. So if you think about, say, someone who's on SSDI versus someone who is someone on SSDI who's making $7,500 versus someone who's making $75,000, $1,200 is going to not go very far, right? And so they're going to have different impacts, and so that's what it means to have equality. So no matter if you make $7,500 a year versus $75,000 a year, you both get $1,200, as opposed to perhaps an equity model where if you have $7,500, you would have more, you would receive more money than 75,000. And then the last thing I will say is justice, just to explain what it means to have equity, equality, and justice. Also, I just realized I didn't finish my Igbo story. The reason why I brought the Igbo story and the Obeya story is because the conversation we've been having is about what you've been classified to this point of being black magic or voodoo, right? Um, we also talk about what it means in, at least in the culture, in Obeya and Igbo culture, what it means to be disabled pre-Christianity. So when the British came to Nigeria and Jamaica and introduced Christianity, what did it mean before that? Well, for folks before then, people who would now be considered to be, say, psychiatrically disabled were not considered to be disabled. Actually, they were the ones who were amplified to be the leaders of the practice, because they were lauded as folks who were able to have conversations with their ancestors or receive those visions, to be able to practice at a higher level, and people would come to them for support and for guidance, and that continued into Jamaica. Now there are folks who say, okay, not saying that, perhaps there isn't something I can receive help with, but to what extent is this a disability in sort of a more capitalistic mindset of capitalistic, meaning that your worth is based on how much you can work or how productive you can be, how much work you can get done in a certain amount of time. So what it means to have equity is important. It is sort of the lifeblood of what it means to have a society that holds each other in positive regard. I always say, if you think about a car that's sort of on its way out, it's making sure that you are fixing the engine or the transmission of the car, and not getting too focused on the way a car looks on the outside or feels on the inside. Whereas justice would mean that we are coming to an understanding and an awareness of those different constructs, those ways in which we come together and say, as humans, this is what this means. And how can we move in a way where we can treat folks based on how they show up in the world and what they mean by meeting people where they are, while also having an impact over intent mindset. So they always say, the old adage is that the road to heck is paved with good intentions. So if you just focus on what your intention was in the moment and not what your impact was, it kind of falls flat. But if we focus on how our impact has been, or what people are sharing with us in this moment of hey, there's a yikes or an ouch in the room, then we can do some good work. And justice would be that we would move to a place where that would be less of a conversation. We wouldn't have as much. I think that what I will say is that to construct is neither a good nor a bad thing. It's a human thing. We just do this as humans, and so whether it's race or back in the day whether it's piety, one of the favorite stories I like to share about this is that there used to be a period of time in Europe where there was like 3 popes. I think there was a pope in France, a pope in Spain, and a pope in Italy or something like that. And so they were all trying to see which is going to be the pope, the pope, which obviously the Vatican won out. But in this time period, it was before that. And so the different sort of clergy from different areas would come, and they wanted to show how pious they were, or how religious and how strong of a relationship with God that they had. And so the best way to show piety was stoicism, or this sort of belief that you could just stay in your truth and hold your space without allowing too much human emotion and interaction to happen. So they would open up their robes in town square in front of the other clergy and show the extent to which their body was covered in body lice. Because the people who had more body lice on their body, they were seen to be more stoic because they were able to withstand that level of irritant without having any sort of changes in their behavior. We just do this. I hope that we don't go back to a period where we are constructing who would say a patient person based on how much body lice they can accumulate on their body, but it has happened. And so I think what's important is to be aware of the fact that we do this. And so finally, moving towards justice and being an accomplice or someone in solidarity, I was thinking about, like I said, with privilege, that there's a choice when you wake up in the morning. Do you have to think about the way your hair looks or the way that you talk? If you think about professionalism or politeness or manners, then think like, but why is this what we see as mannerly? Why is this language what we consider professional? Why do is this sort of hair texture or clothing style the way that we have to do things? And really asking those core questions of why. But there was one time I did a training with youth, and it was one of the most astute ways that I have heard about how to be an accomplice. And so we talked about, and there was a framework of all the different sort of, or a lot of different sort of lived experiences. And there was a group of youth leaders, and I went around to these different groups. This is one of the 4 times we could be in person. And I went to this group of youth leaders there at a table, and I asked them, sort of what I lived experiences that they found that were privileged versus not. And I said, well, the only identity that we had that was not privileged was that they were youth and that they were marginalized genders. And I said, okay, well, what does it mean for you to be an accomplice? And they said, well, because of all the things, these are the only two, because it was also a private school. So they said, hey, we have class privilege. We have, tone privilege, or they were white. So race and skin tone privilege, all these different sort of things. They're like, so all of those different privileges that we have, all of those lived experiences that we don't have to be constantly thinking about all the time, those are ones that we have more energy and time and effort to put towards equity work than someone who does have to think about that all the time. You're thinking about equity work, and then on top of that equity work, say, as a Black Indigenous person of color, equity work as a person of size, equity work as a marginalized gender, equity work as a person who's under resourced or unresourced. And so they're like, if we are have the privilege of time and energy here, then that time and energy that we are afforded should go towards doing more work. And so I would say at this space, if you are finding spaces where you're like, oh wow, like I may be facing this as a disabled person, for example, and I have to think about ableism, but perhaps not think about racism, then think about ways in which say a Black Indigenous person of color who also is disabled would have to think about both. And in that, find ways to be in solidarity and provide some of that excess or that extra afforded time and energy to helping that person find equity. So I will pause there so we have time for questions. But
Yeah,
yeah.
of course. And I can hear you talk about this forever, and I love every time I hear you speak. I learn something new about history as well as all of the social justice issues that you are here to speak about. So thank you for that. So we do have a question in the Q&A, and just as a trend that I have noticed, I have seen not exactly this question, but questions like this continue to pop up. And throughout the conference, I do want to say there are no easy answers to big questions. And that's just for the audience, but we have how do you or would you address an older person in the disability rights movement that is particularly against Black Lives Matter, is saying all lives matter, promoting Trump? Is it connected or is it separate? Is the question that we have.
It's very connected, and there's so many pieces. I'm just gonna like, I'm gonna make it. I'm gonna make a deal with myself right now to keep it to two pieces. So I think I'm gonna keep it to the piece of like intergenerational organizing and what it means, and I think also how it folds into disability rights versus disability justice and what that means. So let's go to the first piece. So remember I said how the Civil Rights Act was passed in 1964, and that was 57 years ago. One of the fun things about social psychology, which is my background, by the way, if you're wondering why I'm talking like a psychologist, it's just I just want to know why human's human. I don't understand it. I don't understand people. I think it's being autistic and being told this is the right way to do things, and I'm like, why? So anyway, so um, so what they said is that the age of sentience, which essentially means the age that you start to become aware of the world around you and start to track how like other people and how and create memories and stuff like that, is 5. So 5 years old. 5 plus 57 would be 62, right? So I would say anyone who is 62 years old and older would likely remember in America before the Civil Rights Act, which means in America, and especially during a time where it was highly contentious, meaning that people were fighting a lot about whether or not there should be civil rights. So if you think back to when you were 5, so kindergarten and up, you probably are thinking about some parts of your life that were very instrumental in who you are today, how you understand the world, what, social constructs, those rules of the way things are supposed to be are, how you talk to people, the way that you access information, all of those different sort of things are all things you probably started to learn from the time you were 5 up, how you interact with strangers, all these different sort of things, right? Well, imagine that before Martin Luther King's I Had a Dream speech, before the Civil Rights Act. So, for example, our president right now was 19 years old when the Civil Rights Act was passed. 19 years old. So he was very much like a full grown adult, right? And he's 74. So, we have people who are older than that, that's happening. Then, on top of that, the Americans with Disabilities Act, or the ADA, wasn't even passed until 1990. That was only 30 years ago. So again, age of sentience, 35. Anyone 35 years old or older would probably remember and would have started school without an Americans with Disabilities Act, which means there was no protection for them to actually go to school, or to have any accommodations in school, to get on the bus, to have a ramp for their house, anything like that. The reason why I say this is because some of these issues, we talk about them as if they are hundreds of years old, right? But they're not. They're not only not old in a historical sense, they're within living memory, which means there are people not just alive today, but in power, making decisions, allocating resources, making policy that come from a time before some of the protections or the declarations, like policies that we take for granted now, were even in place. And on top of that, the really frustrating thing about policy change is simply because you write a law and then you put that law into place and then you make the shortest month of the year the holiday to talk about that law, doesn't necessarily mean that anyone is actually putting implementing the law. They're actually taking the law and putting it into practice, but that they're just sort of talking about it a lot. The other thing about disability rights versus disability justice, which disability justice was a framework that didn't even come on until the early aughts, the early 2000s, is that disability rights was primarily brought forth through a legal rights framework. A rights framework means that you're going to court, you're creating what they call a case study or case law, or precedent cases, which means that you are getting these small sort of wins through court, and then all those different wins add up to a larger sort of consideration of what's supposed to happen. And so if you think about this, going back to Kimberly Crenshaw talking about Black marginalized genders being disqualified for work simply for being Black women in the 80s. And we're talking about the 504 sit-in that was the precursor to the ADA happening in 1977. You see that people are just coming from a time, and it's a time within their lifetime where a lot of this is not so much it's not that it's, like I said, it's a super old thing. It's that they are dealing with the way that they were brought up in space. Now, there has been a lot of, ever since, at least in my lifetime, I was born in 86. I'm an old millennial. But especially in the beginning of my life, there was a lot of what they call sort of oh, I don't see color sort of stuff, post-racial society myth, right, where they're like, oh well, Martin Luther King had a dream and this woman sat on a bus and now we have this law and everything's fine, just don't talk about it. And we've had to come to this space where it's like, no, we have to talk about it. And to be completely honest, that sort of conversation around, actually we may have or continue to have a racism issue in America, wasn't even brought back up until Barack Obama was elected president in 2008. 2008, we're talking 12 years ago. So I'm answering this, and it may not be as there isn't really a lot of, we're not yet in a space to have a lot of solutions for what it means for people who have been brought up in time and space where this was just not a thing. And now these folks are grappling with what it means to live in a world where the construct of what it means to be in society with each other equitably and justly is changing. It's changing from how they were conditioned to see the world, how they were conditioned to see themselves, what they have, when we go back to things like what is polite. It was not polite to talk about race explicitly like this. It was seen actually as an act of aggression. And people would say, hey, you're playing the race card, as if it was a way to purposely shame someone in the moment. So the only real thing that can happen is to model the sort of way that we need to be in this world, to continue to advocate and push against status quo, or any status quo is anytime someone's like, well, that's the way it's always been, or well, this is how this is what it was, I don't know why y'all want to change it. That's usually a status quo situation. And if people are open to change, I think it's could be important to send them to places, get them started on self-learning and education, to certain spaces and information that they could start. I say it's important to start people on self-education because Google and its algorithms are specifically designed to keep folks within a certain ideological mindset. And so if you tell someone to go and Google it themselves, they could land on a page or information that could be based on how they used to think and not how we would like them to consider in moving forward.
Thank you. We have about 6 minutes left. We have two questions in the queue. Let's see if we can get to them. But the first one, kind of going in a different direction, but in what way does media play in the disability movement? And it goes further. Would you say that the societal desirability phenomenon is the main contributor of why the general public can't accept disability in society?
Yes, and I think media plays a huge space. This is especially true, I think, for like older Gen Z and millennials, but and older. But I would even challenge y'all to think about a cartoon that you perhaps used to watch a couple of years ago. You used to and watch some old episodes if you haven't for a while, and think about the ways in which it is sending narratives and to youth who are not thinking critically about these things, right? Sending narratives to them. One of my favorite movies when I was growing up, if you want to watch it, like content warning galore, but one of my favorite movies to watch when I was younger, before I started thinking critically about it, was Good Burger. Good Burger was this movie. It used to come from the original iteration of All That on Nickelodeon. It was All That was like it was kind of like a Saturday Night Live skit for kids. And there was a skit that had Kenan Thompson before Kenan Thompson was Kenan Thompson on SNL, and Kel Mitchell, who was a person who I always thought Kel was supposed to be a Black autistic person because I just also recognized a lot of myself in that. And I went back to watch the movie for nostalgia. Whew. And so there was a lot of like ableism and saneism. I mean, there was some good anti-capitalistic messages in there, but it was a lot. And so it made me think, as this was a movie I watched a lot because it was one of the only real characters on television in the media that I could relate to, that had a job and had friends and was sort of in the community living independently, but also, stimmed and act the way I did, and sort of things like that. He it was kind of this narrative around people taking him for granted and thinking that he was not aware or whatever because of his the way that he showed up. But I think that the media continues this, and even if it's not for kids, I think just the way that the news reports certain things is also important. The way that we teach history in school, we don't teach disability history. We see, I see, for example, offerings for on Noggin or Sprout or whatever the kids shows are now. The channels where it's having more diversity of race and nationality and ethnicity, or perhaps disability, but I'm not seeing both, for example. And so even then, I'm not really seeing like what it looks like to be a Black disabled child in a way that isn't also seen as like a tragic sort of thing. And so I think all of that really comes in together. And I think to loop that into the second question, the way that we can start to have conversations with younger generations, I think first is to have representation. I think to normalize that, that first of all, sort of as I was sharing with my heritage, that to ask why again, to challenge the status quo and social constructs of what it means to be a disabled person, or especially with intersectionality. Like when I was coming up, there used to be a program called the DARE program, and it was supposed to be anti-drugs. And they would have a police officer with this colorful uniform because kids love color, I guess, who would patrol the school. But when I was stimming or with my psychiatric disability, or what they said was my psychiatric disability, what my family community said was part of my spirituality, which that's a whole, I feel like we can have a whole conversation about that. and they said, oh, well, no, you're not talking to your ancestors, you're hallucinating. And so the dare officer will pull me out of class and take me to a hospital in the middle of the school day to test me for whether or not I use drugs. Um, and when I saw other students in my classroom, other students who had IEP plans or was in IEP classes, they who were white, they would stim or dissociate, they were not pulled out of class by the dare officer. So it was already a way that I saw that I was being treated inequitably or unfairly. And so having conversations, I think, around the rights, one of the things I wish that I had, and I think is important, around the rights of your bodily autonomy, the rights of being taken out of class, or being forced to take drug talk screens or anything like that, I think could be really great if I had known perhaps like the language or who to call or what to do in those moments, that could have helped. And I've seen recent reports of like 6-year-olds being taken out of classes and given psych evaluations. And I think that having conversations around this equity and construct early could really help.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Christiane. I wish we could have hours to talk. For everybody who's been part of the conference, we do have the Discord. The Discord chat will be up in a bit, and we can continue conversations there. And just once again, Christiana, thank you so much for coming. And I hope everybody enjoys the rest of the conference. Have a great day. I hope you come to the social this evening.
Thank you.